In the winter of 190 before Christ, the largest army Asia had assembled since the days of Alexander the Great advanced toward a dusty plain between two rivers at the foot of Mount Sipylus in what is now western Turkey. 70,000 men marched under the banners of the Seleucid Empire, phalanxes of Macedonian pikemen, cataphracts covered in iron from head to toe, chariots fitted with curved blades capable of severing legs at full gallop, 54 Indian war elephants, the tanks of the ancient world, and at the head of it all, a king who called himself the Great. A king who had marched from Armenia to India, who had brought Parthians and Bactrians to their knees, who had seized Syria from the Ptolemies and crossed the Hellespont to plant his banner on European soil. A king convinced that on this day he would crush the barbarians from the west and reclaim forever the legacy of Alexander. But on the other side of that plain, beneath a thick fog that blurred every silhouette, something Antiochus had never faced awaited him. It was not a larger army. It was, in fact, much smaller, barely 30,000 men, but each of them carried the weight of a discipline forged across decades of relentless wars. Roman legionaries, men who had destroyed Carthage, who had humiliated Macedonia, who had crossed seas and continents not for glory but for dominion, and among them the shadow of a name that made the world tremble, Scipio. And when the two armies finally collided, the plain split in two. War chariots spun wildly against their own lines. Cataphracts fell beneath a rain of javelins. The phalanx shuddered. The elephants, wounded by darts and stones, turned against their own, trampling the very men they were meant to protect. Screams in a dozen languages blended with the crash of iron. Dust rose like a wall. And when it finally cleared, the mightiest army of the East lay shattered upon the earth. An empire that stretched from Thrace to Persia collapsed in a single afternoon. And the echo of that day would resonate for centuries, because at Magnesia it was not only tens of thousands of men who died. The dream died that anyone could ever again unite the world Alexander had conquered. This is the story of how it happened. To understand what took place on that plain, one must go back more than a century to the death of Alexander the Great in Babylon in the year 323 before Christ. When the Macedonian conqueror drew his last breath at the age of 32, he left behind the greatest empire the world had ever known, but no heir capable of holding it together. His generals, the Diadochi, tore each other apart for decades in a series of brutal wars that shattered the empire into three great kingdoms: the Antigonid in Macedonia and Greece, the Ptolemaic in Egypt, and the Seleucid across the vast territory stretching from Anatolia to the borders of India. Of the three, the Seleucid Empire was the most extensive and, in theory, the most powerful. Founded by Seleucus Nicator, one of Alexander's closest companions, this kingdom inherited the heart of the old Persian Empire: Mesopotamia, Syria, Persia, Media, Bactria. Its cities were centers of Hellenistic culture. Its armies combined the Macedonian tradition of the phalanx with the heavy cavalry of the East. But its immensity was also its weakness. Governing such a vast territory demanded a constant balance between the ambitions of local satraps, the revolts of subject peoples, and the threats of neighboring kingdoms. Throughout the 3rd century before Christ, the empire lost peace after peace. Parthia broke free. Bactria became an autonomous Greek kingdom. The eastern provinces slowly slipped beyond central control. It was in that context of decline that Antiochus III arose. He ascended to the Seleucid throne in the year 223 before Christ, barely 18 years old, inheriting a fractured and weakened empire. The first years of his reign were chaotic. He faced internal rebellions, lost crucial battles against the Ptolemies at Raphia, and watched his authority challenged by his own governors. Any other king would have surrendered, but Antiochus was not any other king. He possessed something his predecessors had lost, an ambition that knew no boundaries, and a tenacity that refused to accept defeats as final. Between the years 212 and 205 before Christ, Antiochus launched the Great Anabasis, a military campaign eastward that took him to reconquer Armenia, subdue the Parthians, penetrate into Bactria, and reach the borders of India. He returned, having restored the empire's frontiers to dimensions not seen since the days of Seleucus Nicator. He was granted the title Antiochus the Great, a deliberate echo of Alexander, and for a brief, luminous moment, it seemed as though the dream of the universal Macedonian Empire might live again. But in the West, a new and relentless force was rewriting the rules of the world: Rome. The Roman Republic had just destroyed Carthage in the Second Punic War, a titanic struggle that had lasted 17 years. The general who sealed that victory was named Publius Cornelius Scipio, and the world would know him as Scipio Africanus, the man who defeated Hannibal at Zama. After crushing Carthage, Rome turned its gaze eastward. In the year 197 before Christ, Roman legions crushed Macedonia at the Battle of Cynocephaly, proving that the legendary Macedonian phalanx could be beaten by the flexibility and discipline of the legionary system. Two of the three kingdoms that had inherited Alexander's empire had already fallen beneath Rome's shadow. Only the Seleucid remained. Antiochus, intoxicated by his victories in the east, committed the error that would seal his fate. He crossed the Hellespont into Thrace, claiming territories that had belonged to Seleucus Nicator a century before. He occupied Greek cities in Asia Minor, and when the Aetolian League, resentful of Rome for the scraps it had received after the war against Macedonia, offered him an alliance, Antiochus accepted. In the year 192 before Christ, the Seleucid king landed in Greece with an expeditionary force, openly defying Rome. It was a provocation the Romans could not ignore, and they did not. To make the situation even more dramatic, at the court of Antiochus stood a man whose name alone was enough to freeze the blood of any Roman senator: Hannibal Barca. The Carthaginian, after his defeat at Zama and the end of the Second Punic War, had fled Carthage when Rome demanded his surrender. He wandered the Mediterranean until he found refuge with Antiochus in Ephesus in the year 195 before Christ. The greatest enemy Rome had ever known was now advising the most powerful king of the East. It was Rome's nightmare, made real. But Antiochus did not listen to Hannibal as he should have. The Carthaginian proposed a bold strategy: open a second front in Italy, set the peninsula ablaze, while Antiochus attacked from the east. But the Seleucid king distrusted the exiled general. He feared that if he gave Hannibal an army, the Carthaginian would accumulate too much power. He relegated him to commanding the fleet, a secondary role for the greatest land strategist of antiquity. It was a mistake that would cost dearly. Antiochus's Greek campaign was a disaster. In April of the year 191 before Christ, Roman legions crushed him at Thermopylae, the same pass where 300 Spartans had stood against the Persians 3 centuries earlier. The irony was devastating. Antiochus, who saw himself as Alexander's heir, was expelled from Greece at the very place where the Greeks had stopped the greatest Eastern invader in history. He fled back to Asia Minor with the remnants of his army. But the war was not over. The Romans, now determined to end the Seleucid threat once and for all, crossed the Hellespont. In command was the consul Lucius Cornelius Scipio, known as Scipio Asiaticus, younger brother of Scipio Africanus. But the true mind behind the campaign was Africanus himself, who accompanied his brother as legate. The man who had defeated Hannibal was now marching against the last great Hellenistic kingdom. Meanwhile, the Seleucid fleet under Hannibal's command was defeated by the Rhodians at the Eurymedon. A second naval defeat at Myonnesus sealed Roman control of the Aegean, Antiochus lost any chance of preventing the Roman crossing into Asia. Hannibal, seeing the cause was lost, fled to Crete. The great Carthaginian would not be at Magnesia. Antiochus tried to negotiate. He offered to pay half the war costs and abandon his claims to the Greek cities allied with Rome. The Romans rejected the offer. They demanded that Antiochus give up all territory north and west of the Taurus Mountains. It was the dissolution of the western half of his empire. Antiochus could not accept. He had no choice but to fight. During the autumn of the year 190 before Christ, as the Romans advanced from Pergamon, Antiochus assembled the largest army the Seleucid Empire had ever mobilized. He summoned troops from every corner of his vast domain. Macedonian phalanxes arrived from Syria, along with the feared Argyraspides, the Silver Shields, the elite of Seleucid infantry. Cataphracts from Media, riders armored from helmet to knee, mounted on equally armored horses. Companion cavalrymen in the Macedonian tradition. Dahae horse archers from the steppes of Central Asia. Galatian horsemen from Anatolia, Cretan archers, Elymaian slingers, Arabian camels, and the scythed war chariots, relics of an earlier age that Antiochus hoped to use as a shock weapon. But the most impressive element of the Seleucid arsenal was the elephants. 54 Indian war beasts, larger and fiercer than the African elephants the Romans had faced in the wars against Carthage. Antiochus distributed them among the phalanx sections, 22 of them interspersed between the 10 pikeman battalions, creating a line that appeared invincible. 16 more stood behind the right wing and another 16 behind the left. An anecdote, perhaps apocryphal but revealing, tells that Antiochus, gazing upon the formation of his army in all its magnificence, turned to Hannibal and asked whether this force would be enough for the Romans. Hannibal, who had already left the court before the battle, supposedly replied with a phrase loaded with sarcasm, "Enough for the Romans, however greedy they may be." He was not praising the army. He was mocking its opulence, its gleaming armor and golden standards. Hannibal, who had crossed the Alps with ragged men and made Rome tremble for 15 years, knew that wars were not won with splendor, but with discipline. On the Roman side, the army was more modest in appearance, but lethal in its efficiency. Approximately 30,000 men formed the core of the force. At the center, the legions deployed in the classic triple formation, the young Hastati at the front, the experienced Principes in the second line, and the veteran Triarii at the rear, an iron reserve that only entered combat when everything else had failed. These were men accustomed to war. Many had fought in the Punic Wars, in Hispania, in Greece. They knew the taste of blood and the weight of victory. The right wing was entrusted to Eumenes II, king of Pergamon, and a crucial Roman ally. Eumenes contributed around 800 Pergamene horsemen, combined with some 2,000 Roman and Italian cavalrymen. Ahead of the main line, 3,000 Achaean and Pergamene light infantry deployed alongside 800 Cretan and Illyrian archers. In the rear, 16 African elephants, smaller than their Indian cousins, waited in reserve. The Romans knew they could not pit them directly against the Seleucid colossi. One absence weighed heavily over the Roman camp. Scipio Africanus, the man whose mere presence inspired terror in the enemies of Rome, had fallen ill. The victor of Zama, the most celebrated general of his time, would not be able to take part in the battle. Operational command fell to Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a competent officer but one without the fame of the Scipios. Nevertheless, the strategy had already been drawn, and Eumenes of Pergamon, a man of sharp gaze and brilliant tactical mind, was about to prove that one did not need to be Roman to decide a battle. Antiochus chose his battlefield on a plain at the foot of Mount Sipylus, near the city of Magnesia, flanked by the rivers Phrygios and Hermos. It was open terrain, ideal for deploying his numerical superiority and, above all, for using his cavalry and chariots. The Romans, aware of their inferiority in horsemen, maneuvered to anchor their left flank against the Hermos River, partially neutralizing the threat of an envelopment by Seleucid cavalry. For 5 days, the two armies stared at each other from their camps without attacking. The tension became unbearable. Antiochus sent detachments of Dahae and Galatian cavalry to provoke the Romans, but they refused to take the bait. Scipio Asiaticus knew he needed a victory before a new consul arrived from Rome to replace him, but he also knew that patience could be deadlier than haste. Finally, on a December dawn, fog covered the plain like a shroud. The air was heavy, damp, almost tangible. Visibility was scarce, and that gloom equalized the forces in an unexpected way. The Seleucid superiority in archers was neutralized by the mist. The Romans could not see the immensity of the army that outnumbered them by more than 2 to 1. And Antiochus's soldiers could not appreciate how small the force facing them truly was. Eumenes of Pergamon was the first to grasp the opportunity. He studied the Seleucid formation and deduced that Antiochus would launch his scythed chariots first, those machines of terror designed to sow panic in enemy lines before the main clash. And he was right. The thunder arrived before sight. A roar of hooves against the earth, the metallic screech of blades spinning on axles. The Seleucid chariots burst from the fog like iron beasts, hurled directly at the Roman right wing where Eumenes commanded. The drivers whipped the horses. The lateral blades cut through the air with a piercing whistle. To any soldier who watched them approach, they must have seemed like death itself galloping forward. But Eumenes did not flinch. He had anticipated exactly this moment. He ordered his Cretan archers, slingers, and skirmishers to advance in open formation with a precise instruction: do not aim for the drivers, aim for the horses. The order was brilliant in its simplicity. A chariot with a dead driver kept moving. A chariot with wounded horses became an uncontrollable weapon. The first volley of arrows and sling stones struck the animals. Horses screamed in agony. One fell, another bolted sideways. The chariots began spinning on themselves, out of control. And then what Eumenes had calculated and Antiochus had not imagined occurred. The chariots, maddened, wheeled around and plunged into the Seleucid lines themselves. The blades that were meant to shred Romans severed the legs of Seleucid cataphracts instead. The Arabian camels, terrified by the chaos, fled the field. The Dahae, mounted archers, scattered. Within minutes, the Seleucid left wing had become a confused mass of men and beasts trying to get away from each other. Eumenes did not wait. With the precision of a surgeon and the ferocity of a lion, he launched his cavalry directly against the cataphracts who were trying to regroup. The charge was devastating. 3,000 cataphracts, the most heavily armored riders in the ancient world, were swept aside by a force smaller in number but superior in cohesion and speed. The Galatians, Cappadocians, and mercenaries who flanked the phalanx on the left were overrun simultaneously by Roman infantry advancing from the center. The Seleucid left wing ceased to exist. Meanwhile, at the opposite end of the battlefield, Antiochus launched his own charge. The king, mounted at the head of his cataphracts and the cavalry of the royal Agema, threw himself against the Latin infantry on the Roman left wing with the fury of a man who believed himself the heir of Alexander. And for a moment, it seemed as though history was repeating itself. The Latin legionaries, struck by the mass of iron and muscle crashing upon them, fell back. The line broke. Men fled toward the Roman camp. Antiochus tasted victory on that flank. But then he committed the same mistake that had haunted him throughout his entire career, the same error he had made at Raphia 27 years before. He pursued too far. Instead of wheeling his cavalry to strike the Roman center from the rear, as Alexander would have done, as Hannibal would have done, Antiochus pressed onward, throwing himself against the Roman camp. There, 2,000 mercenaries and the tribune Emilius defended the palisades with fierce determination. The Seleucid cavalry, unable to take a fortified camp, became bogged down in a futile fight while the battle was decided at their backs. Because in the center, the Seleucid phalanx was dying. The 16,000 Macedonian pikemen had advanced with their characteristic discipline, the 6-meter sarissas pointing forward like a forest of steel. Against conventional infantry, that formation was virtually impenetrable. But the Roman legion was not conventional infantry. The legionaries did not try to smash through the phalanx in a frontal clash. They kept their distance, hurling pila, the heavy Roman javelins designed to bend on impact, rendering the phalangites' shields useless. Velites and skirmishers bombarded the formation with darts, sling stones, and arrows from the flanks. The phalanx began a slow retreat, maintaining its cohesion, seeking to fall back toward the camp. It was then that the elephants destroyed it. Not the Roman elephants, the Seleucid elephants themselves. The 22 Indian colossi interspersed among the phalanx battalions, tormented by the projectiles raining down upon them, went berserk. A wounded elephant does not flee from the enemy. It flees from everything. The animals stampeded through the Seleucid ranks, crushing the very pikemen they were meant to protect. Formations shattered, lines of sarissas, which only functioned in perfect order, dissolved into chaos of wood and iron. The phalangites, trapped in a formation too dense to maneuver, cast aside their long pikes and tried to flee. The Roman legionaries needed no second invitation. Domitius Ahenobarbus ordered a general advance. The legions surged upon the broken phalanx with brutal efficiency. With their short swords, the gladii, perfect for close-quarters combat that the sarissa could not handle, the Romans drove between the disorganized ranks and began the slaughter. The argyraspides, the silver shields, attempted to form a defensive square, pointing their pikes in every direction like an iron hedgehog. They held out longer than the rest, but surrounded without cavalry support, without any room to maneuver. They were annihilated one by one beneath a rain of javelins and the relentless advance of the legionaries. Eumenes, having destroyed the left wing, wheeled his cavalry and charged into the flanks of the dying phalanx. The encirclement was complete. The men who carried Alexander's weapons were butchered by the swords of Rome. When Antiochus finally managed to disengage from the Roman camp and galloped back toward the center of the battlefield, what he found froze his blood. Where hours before the greatest army of the East had stood, now there were only bodies, dead horses, dying elephants, and the distant thunder of Roman cavalry chasing the fugitives. His standards lay in the dust. His generals had died or fled. His phalanx, the symbol of 130 years of Macedonian supremacy, had been annihilated. Antiochus understood that all was lost. He gathered the survivors of his cavalry and fled toward Sardis, leaving behind tens of thousands of dead and wounded. The Romans, meanwhile, plundered the Seleucid camp, where they found a bounty of gold, silver, weapons, and provisions that surpassed anything they had captured outside of Carthage. Casualty figures vary depending on the sources. Livy claims 50,000 Seleucids perished. Modern historians offer more conservative estimates, placing Seleucid losses at around 10,000 dead, with thousands more captured alongside 15 elephants. Roman casualties were significantly lower, perhaps 5,000 according to current calculations, although Livy reduces them to an implausibly low figure of 349. Regardless of the exact numbers, the scale of the Roman victory was indisputable. The most powerful army the East had managed to assemble had been destroyed in a single afternoon by a force markedly smaller in number. The silence that fell over the plain of Magnesia that night was more eloquent than any victory speech. The Romans lit bonfires among the corpses. Surgeons worked by torchlight, cauterizing wounds, amputating shattered limbs. The smell of blood and burned flesh permeated the winter air. The soldiers, exhausted, ate in silence, staring at the field where thousands of men had died, screaming in languages they did not understand. The surviving elephants wandered the plain like grey ghosts, some still with arrows lodged in their flanks, bellowing into the darkness. Riderless horses trotted among the corpses, searching for water, and somewhere in the night, Antiochus was galloping towards Sardis with the remnants of his escort, knowing that his empire would never be the same again. Antiochus understood immediately that prolonging the war was futile. He sent envoys to the Romans to negotiate peace. The terms Rome imposed were devastating. In the year 188 before Christ, the Treaty of Apamea was signed, one of the most humiliating agreements of antiquity. Antiochus was forced to abandon all territory north and west of the Taurus Mountains, surrendering the entirety of Asia Minor in a single stroke. He was required to pay a colossal war indemnity. He was required to hand over all his war elephants and reduce his fleet to 10 ships. He was required to surrender 20 hostages, including his own son, and he was required to hand over Hannibal. The Carthaginian, however, had already fled. He wandered from court to court for years until, cornered by the Romans in Bithynia, he chose poison over chains. He died in the year 183 before Christ, the same year as his eternal rival, Scipio Africanus, who passed away in bitter retirement at Liternum, abandoned by the very Rome he had saved. The consequences of Magnesia transformed the ancient world. The Seleucid territories in Asia Minor were divided between Pergamon and Rhodes, Rome's faithful allies. The Greek cities that had supported Rome before the battle were granted their independence. The Seleucid Empire, though it still existed as a political entity, was confined to Syria, Mesopotamia, and the eastern provinces. The satrapies that Antiochus had reconquered with such effort revolted upon receiving news of the defeat of the invincible king. Parthia and Bactria declared their independence definitively. The empire began a slow death that would last a century, until Pompey's legions delivered the final blow in the year 64 before Christ. Antiochus III died in the year 187 before Christ, barely a year after the Treaty of Apamea. Attempting to raise funds to pay the Roman indemnity, he plundered a temple in Elymais in Persia. The local inhabitants killed him. The king who had marched to India, who had restored an empire and defied Rome, died as a temple looter in a remote province. But the meaning of Magnesia transcends the fall of a single king or a single empire. On that plane, something far deeper was decided. It was the last time a power from the Hellenistic East challenged Rome on an open battlefield. It was the moment when the Macedonian phalanx, the formation that had conquered the known world under Alexander, definitively proved its inferiority against the Roman legion. The sarissa was lethal when the phalanx maintained its cohesion, but fragile when it broke. The Roman gladius, short and versatile, proved superior in real combat, where chaos, dust, and blood did not allow the perfect formations of military manuals. In 8 years, between Cynocephalae and Magnesia, Rome had defeated 2 of the 3 kingdoms that had inherited Alexander's empire. The third, Egypt, was already under Roman protection. The dream of reunifying Alexander's empire died forever on that Anatolian plain. No one would ever attempt it again. And Rome, the small city on the Tiber that barely a century before had been fighting for survival against Hannibal, became the dominant power of the Mediterranean, not because it was larger or richer or more cultured than its rivals, but because it possessed something no Hellenistic kingdom had ever managed to replicate: an unbreakable discipline, an unmatched capacity for adaptation, and a collective will that turned every defeat into the prelude to a greater victory. The plain of Magnesia keeps today a silence that reveals nothing of what happened. The rivers still flow. Mount Sipylus still watches over the valley. No monument marks the exact spot where the phalanx collapsed, where the elephants went mad, where Alexander's dream drew its last breath. But beneath that soil, beneath that grass that grows indifferent to history, lie the remains of a world that ceased to exist on a winter afternoon. And the echo of that battle, silent and invisible, still resonates in every border Rome drew, in every language it imposed, in every road it built upon the ashes of the empires it destroyed. Because Magnesia was not merely a battle, it was a sentence. The sentence that condemned the Hellenistic East to irrelevance and consecrated Rome as the master of the known world. And that sentence, delivered by iron and blood on a forgotten plain of Anatolia, would define the course of civilization for the next 500 years.